Another often emotional day of testimony there, including testimony we heard earlier this morning from George Floyd's girlfriend. So day 4 of the trial, taking a quick recess for lunch. But for more on what we've seen today, what we've heard, let's bring in Alan Jenkins, a professor of practice at Harvard Law School. Alan, of course, this is not the first time a police officer has been on trial, but do you think this trial in particular will change the way that police officers, one, do their jobs, or two, are held accountable moving forward?
Well, I think that this case has already done some things to create greater accountability, right? So the videotaped death of George Floyd, as you know, led to the largest social movement that we've seen in our nation, at least in the last century. And we have seen some changes in different parts of the country, changes in law, changes in practice, changes in training and in funding to try to hold officers more fully accountable, and also to create more just and equitable public safety systems. As to this trial, it's hard to know. I do think, two things that I took away from the last few days of the trial. One was that everyone on the street, almost everyone, tried to help Mr. Floyd, except for the police. The bystanders, teenagers, people with video cameras, off-duty firefighters, paramedics that we just heard from, all were worried about Mr. Floyd and trying to help him. The only people who were not trying to help Mr. Floyd were the police officers whose job it is to ensure that we're all kept safe. And I think the fact that the nation's attention is turned towards that is going to be important to helping to drive change, including possibly some of the federal legislation we see pending. The other thing that I think was really evident in the last few days was the incredible trauma, not just to Mr. Floyd in the last moments of his life, but to everyone who was on the street observing this. We saw witness after witness break down crying. People express guilt that they couldn't or weren't able to do more. Even the cashier whose discovery of a apparently counterfeit bill started the chain of events that led to the police being called, not by him, but apparently by his boss, expressed regret that he didn't do more. We can't continue to have a society in which people are afraid that if the police come, it's going to result in someone's unnecessary death. And so I'm hopeful that this trial will result in some change.
What is it about this particular trial? These issues are not new. These calls for reform and change are not new. This is not the first time that a police officer has been put on trial. What is it about this particular case, this particular trial? Is it just seeing it? Is it the video?
The video is hugely important, right? And so we know, or we can assume, that had this same scenario played out without being captured on video, there would not have been the kind of public response, the outcry, and possibly not the prosecution that we're seeing. But it's also, I believe, the cavalier way in which Derek Chauvin put his knee and kept his knee for, we now know, 9 minutes and 20 seconds on Mr. Floyd's neck, despite the fact that people around him were begging for him to stop, were telling him and his fellow officers that Mr. Floyd's life was in danger and that Mr. Floyd was no danger. Being able to see that play out really told us not only about Officer Chauvin and his fellow officers on the scene, but about a culture of impunity and a belief on the part of many in the criminal justice system that they are above the law and untouchable, and that the lives of Black and brown people don't matter. I don't think we've certainly seen many terrible deaths of people at the hands of police officers in the last several years. I don't know that we've seen any that were as dramatic in their message about the system.
Alan, as you probably know, New York City just moved to end qualified immunity that had previously prevented police officers from being sued or being held liable for any sort of misconduct. Would this be a different case if qualified immunity had been ended prior to the incident in Minneapolis?
Well, this notion of qualified immunity wouldn't have directly affected this case. And let me just take a moment to say what that principle is. Qualified immunity, Mullah, is the idea that if a police officer or certain other officials violate your rights and you sue them civilly, right? You file a lawsuit, civil rights lawsuit against them. In order to win, you have to prove not only that they violated your rights, but that those rights were clearly established by some prior judicial ruling, some prior court ruling at the time that those rights were violated. That's something unique in the law. It was created by judges in the Supreme Court to protect police officers who were found to have violated civil rights, and more and more observers on the both conservative, progressive, in the center are deciding that it's a bad approach and that it allows a culture of impunity and too often lawlessness. However, because the trial of Officer Chauvin is a criminal trial, this precise principle of qualified immunity is not directly relevant. However, a lot of people do believe that the existence of qualified immunity as a doctrine for now 50 some odd years has helped contribute to this idea and the belief that police officers are above the law. And so perhaps something like this terrible death would have been less likely to occur in the first place if police officers and police departments were fully aware that they were going to be held accountable for their actions in the same way that any other citizen or resident would be.
So qualified immunity, I mean, is something now that is certainly being looked at, as well as a lot of contributing dynamics to things that lead to these sort of incidents. Is that fair?
Yes, very much so. So New York City is acting to limit the influence of qualified immunity. Connecticut, Colorado, many other places. As I said, the George Floyd policing Justice in Policing Act that is being debated right now in the U.S. Congress would also significantly limit qualified immunity. But as you note, Mullah, there are a lot of other actions that are being taken. Some are making sure we have better data, that we actually know who's being stopped, where is force being used by officers based on race and location and the identity of the police department. That's important for accountability. And perhaps more important, and certainly more transformative, is a real re-examining about how we ensure public safety and equal justice in our communities. Many of us who are people of color who have folks in our families struggling with mental illness, if someone who we love has a mental health crisis, as people of color, most of us are not going to call the police. We're not even going to call 911 because we don't want people with guns coming to address a situation that requires de-escalation. And that's really unacceptable. And so some of the most innovative and I think exciting approaches are really investing in alternative services so that healthcare workers, public health care and mental health care workers, for example, will be the ones to show up in that kind of situation. So I think this is a very important moment in our country where we're re-examining how to keep everyone safe, how to uphold the values of equal justice and prevention and accountability.
Alan Jenkins, thank you for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.